The 21 Ecumenical Councils have taken us all over the place. We've seen the Church combat all sorts of heresies, Arianism, of course, being one of the most famous ones, but then there were the lesser-known heresies like monothelitism and its brother, monophysitism. We've seen how heresies don't really die, they just morph into something different, like how Islam may have had its roots in Arianism, or how Mormonism is a form of Arianism. Sometimes heresies will hibernate and resurface at a later date, like we saw with iconoclasm. We've seen the political world change around the Catholic Church, forcing her to wrestle with its place in the world. It went from being persecuted to being protected, to being the official religion of an empire, to being a kingmaker, to being kidnapped by kings, to having no temporal power, and finally to be treated as an entirely separate entity from the state. We've seen the struggle of power within the church as councils met to define and redefine guardrails for the bishops. We've seen rightful popes reluctantly take the reins and anti-popes claim to be the supreme ruler. We've seen long stints of time where there was no pope, and we've seen times where there were 2 or even 3 people claiming to be the successor of St. Peter. And we've seen the stories of legends, like when jolly old St. Nicholas slapped Arius, or when Polychronius had a cadaver brought into a council and began whispering the Monophysite creed into the dead man's ear, vainly hoping he would come back to life so he could prove everyone that his theology was right. Or when King Philip the Fair raided and arrested the Knights Templar on Friday the 13th, and ever since, Friday the 13th has become a superstition. If the Catholic Church is a continuum, then the 21 Ecumenical Councils are like snapshots, like pictures of you at various stages that you hang in your parents' house forever. That's the cute baby picture, the photo taken in kindergarten, the awkward early teenager years, the graduation picture, and so on. If you've been following this series, then you've watched the Catholic Church evolve, and these 21 Ecumenical Councils are its defining moments, sometimes rather insignificant and sometimes monumental. There are moments of growth, sometimes pivots. We all have those, like the time you move to a new state, or you graduate from college, or you start a family, or a new job. And it's important not to just examine one, but to see all of them in a continuum we call the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Hi, I'm Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you're new to this podcast, my story was that I grew up in a devout Baptist home. I was an evangelical pastor for 11 years. I spent 39 years of my life as a Protestant, and I came home to the Catholic Church at age 41. Why Catholic is my labor of love, and it's a legacy I want to leave to this world. And if you've been blessed by this podcast, I would love for you to help make its footprint. You can do that by becoming a monthly or annual supporter. Just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. And if nothing else, help others find this podcast by leaving it a 5-star rating on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you have a second, you can even leave a review. Thank you so much for your support and being a part of the Why Catholic community. Since episode 146, we've been in a series on the 21 Ecumenical Church Councils. Pardon me while I get a little nostalgic. Almost exactly a year ago, I started planning out this series, and really it was for selfish reasons. I've always wanted to know more about the Ecumenical Councils, and what better way to learn about them than to produce a series on them that would force me to do my research. I always say that the best way to learn something is by teaching it, and that's what I did. And boy, I had no idea how much work this would take. I estimate that each episode required an average of 10 to 20 hours of research, writing, editing, and producing. So, counting this episode, there have been 29 episodes, meaning if we say each episode took about 15 hours, then it has taken a total of 435 hours to produce this series. And as I've mentioned, I personally write out every single episode. And so if you're wondering what that looks like over 92,000 words and nearly 200 pages. And if you're thinking, gee, that's like a book. Yes. That's exactly what I'm thinking. Maybe I need to turn this into a book. But I couldn't do this without some great resources. So let me express my thanks to a few sources I repeatedly turn to. First, whoever manages the papalencyclicals.net website, thank you. It is such a blessing to read primary source documents, and it's laid out so beautifully. A huge thank you as well to the people at newadvent.org who have put together a priceless library of information and primary sources, especially when it comes to the early church fathers. Joseph Kelly's book, The Ecumenical Councils of the Catholic Church, A History, was a godsend. And then there were a number of digital resources that became regular go-tos. Father Timothy Mackin from St. Francis Dallas did a comprehensive online Sunday school series on YouTube. Father Mackin, if you hear this, please know that you became a go-to source for me. Pontifex was a gem to discover. I loved the history and the humor and was a great resource for the early church councils. And last but certainly not least, the History of the Papacy podcast. The host of that show often says, "I'm not a historian," which to me is funny because he probably knows more about history than 99.9% of the population. Leading up to this series, I would have said that I am not a historian. You know what makes you one? Studying history. Boy, it's amazing to think about the things I know now that I didn't know at the start of this series. I had made all sorts of assumptions about these 21 ecumenical councils because that's what we do when we have a vague understanding about history. We make stuff up to fill in the blanks. Really, the history is in the nuance and the details. I want to reflect back on this journey, these 21 ecumenical councils, and give you some takeaways, historical, political, theological, and ecclesiastical revelations that these councils shed light on. I wrote and produced an introduction to this series before I got too far into my research, so if I were rewriting an introduction, having completed all that research, I might write something like this episode. So, here are some things I learned along the way. First, these 21 ecumenical councils should be seen as major markers in the church, where the church recognized some sort of dilemma, theological, ecclesiastical, political, and then felt the need to gather at the table and address it. They are the church's collective effort to reform. However, not all councils are equal. There were some incredibly influential councils like the First Council of Nicaea in 325, the First Council of Constantinople in 381, the Council of Ephesus in 431, the Council of Chalcedon in 451, the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, the Council of Florence in the mid-1400s, the Council of Trent in the mid-1500s, and I'll also include the Second Vatican Council in the mid-20th century. Then there were ones that I would say were weak, maybe even unnecessary or ill-advised in comparison. The first three Lateran councils and the Council of Vienne come to mind. We might think that there's enough chaos in our world that the church should, like the Council of Constance suggested, have an ecumenical council every decade or so. But as we saw in the post-conciliarism period, it's not always easy to control the outcome of a council. When popes call councils, they're inviting all the bishops to the table, even bishops that predecessors may have selected. This is partly why the Curia has learned that it has to do a lot of work in preparing for these councils, getting the right leaders in place, setting the agenda, discussing the direction it wants to steer the church, and how to do it in a way so that it doesn't get derailed. With the ease of travel now, it means that an ecumenical council could be easily attended by a large amount of church leaders. With the earlier ecumenical councils, they were held in a place that influenced who might attend. That isn't the case anymore. And so I would venture to say that we won't see them more often. We may actually see fewer of them. I would be surprised to see them more than every century. Not that I'm going to be alive to see them. A second big takeaway for me was how much geopolitics played in these ecumenical councils, beginning with the first one, the Council of Nicaea. For 300 years, the church faced various waves of persecution. It couldn't breathe. It couldn't meet out in the open. Most everything was done underground. Sometimes there was a lull in persecution, but nothing lasting, and certainly nothing that could be trusted. Bishops wrote each other secret letters. There were some periods of time where it was even too dangerous for the church to gather to elect a new pope. Here it was nearly 300 years old, and so much remained undefined. Many Protestants claim that Constantine changed the church. He interjected politics over it and changed it forever. I see it much different than that. What Constantine allowed the church to do was to gather on a scale like never before and settle really important theological and administrative matters. And while I think politics certainly influenced the church, I don't think it was nearly as much as the church influenced politics. I think Constantine was prudent enough to realize that as Christianity went, so went the empire. I liken Constantine to Ronald Reagan during the 1980 election, something I talked about in episode 103 called Keens to Fight Our Battles. I think Constantine saw that Christianity was really the driving force of society, and working with the church instead of persecuting it or pretending it didn't exist would really benefit him politically. But the challenge is that there seems to always be a tension between the church and the state. Sometimes bishops really want an in the inner courts of the empire. like Eusebius of Nicomedia or the Patriarch Photius of Constantinople. And so often, the influence isn't the church on the state, but rather the state on the church. We saw this with kings trying to fill bishoprics, which was addressed at the First Lateran Council, and this vying for state control of the church happened notably with Pope Clement V and his willingness to bend his knee to King Philip the Fair of France, which led to the start of the Avignon papacy. At so many of these councils, there was this underlying theme, an essential question: what is the church's place in this world? As empires evolve and borders shift and new leaders take the helm, and new political philosophies get played out in the governments, the church asks, how do we influence society? How do we hold to the unwavering truths of Christianity but shift the presentation so as to be relevant? How do we be the kingdom of heaven on earth within this particular context? I don't know that there's a right answer, and I think every council wrestled with it in its own way. My third takeaway is this: schism is Christianity's Achilles heel. Years back, I used to think that until the Protestant Reformation, the church was completely unified. Everyone was Catholic. Then I learned about the Great Schism, and I figured that everyone was one of two churches. And then I read St. Irenaeus' Against Heresies, written in 185, where he talks about all of these rogue strands of Christianity and unauthorized meetings. And then I studied these church councils and saw how many times there were schisms following these councils. These councils met to settle divisions, and there has to be a sense of humility to say, the council has spoken, I am wrong. And what we see from the very beginning is that the heresies continued, or as was the case with people like Eusebius of Nicomedia or Photius of Constantinople or Mark of Ephesus, schismatics were given a voice and derailed the unity that the council tried to achieve. Fourth, this series has convinced me that I made the right decision in becoming Catholic and not Eastern Orthodox. I think the Eastern Orthodox would like to say that they were the original church. I think Protestants who are considering converting to an ancient Christian faith often consider becoming Eastern Orthodox. There is just so much anti-Catholic baggage that it's much easier to consider becoming Eastern Orthodox rather than Catholic. What we see in the First Council, the Council of Nicaea in 325, is that the Council Fathers named the Christian patriarchates, Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. A few years after the First Council of Nicaea, Constantine finished building Constantinople and made it the official capital of the Roman Empire. They even started calling it New Rome. And it was at the First Council of Constantinople in 381 that the Council Fathers interjected Constantinople as one of the patriarchates after the preeminence of Rome. Mind you that this council was made up of almost exclusively Eastern bishops. So not only did the Council Fathers make Constantinople a new patriarchate 350 years after the start of Christianity, but they affirmed Rome's preeminence and authority as having first place. As we've seen in this series, so many heresies originated in Constantinople. Once Arianism was defeated at the Council of Nicaea, it made a resurgence led by the Patriarch of Constantinople. Nestorianism, monothelitism, monophysitism, and iconoclasm all had their origins in Constantinople. It was really the Pope's influence on the Church that we believe in things like the hypostatic union, that Jesus was one person with two distinct natures, fully human and fully divine. When we get to the Eighth Council, this is where things really start to split. So many people want to bring up the Great Schism of 1054, where the papal legates excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople. However, they forget that Photius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, excommunicated the Pope in Rome in the 9th century, and he was so divisive that it prompted the Fourth Council of Constantinople. However, thanks to Photius' influence, even though the Eastern bishops were present at the Fourth Council of Constantinople, they later had their own council in addition to this ecumenical one. And in their mind, that is the true Fourth Council of Constantinople, not the one that the Catholic Church recognizes. It is revisionist history based on schismatic reasoning. Then we jump to 1274 and the Second Council of Lyon, where the Greek delegation from Constantinople came and agreed to come into full communion with the Catholic Church and the Pope in Rome. However, when they went back to Constantinople, they just couldn't sell it to the people. This happened again at the Council of Florence from 1431 to 1435, only this time it was a much larger representation of Greek bishops, including the Patriarch of Constantinople. There was an emphatic agreement, and the one lone holdout who voted against reunification was Mark of Ephesus. He returned back home and started a campaign to derail the agreement, and the Eastern bishops struggled to get their local churches to buy into unity with Rome. And so just like we saw at the Council of Leon, the official agreement to reunify fell apart. To me, this speaks to the problems of the Eastern Orthodox Church structure. What good is a promise of the church leadership if they can't get their churches to follow through with their decision? The other thing that I want to point out is that a common argument from Eastern Orthodox and classical Protestant groups like Lutherans and Presbyterians is that they only accept the first 7 councils as authoritative because those are the only councils that had true ecumenical attendance, meaning bishops from the East and the West. And it's usually an anti-Catholic bias. People who say this just don't know their history. For one, the First Council of Constantinople in 381 didn't have any bishops from the West. They just had a couple of Western allies, one from Alexandria and the other from Thessalonica. And it's silly to say that the Eighth Council wasn't ecumenical because that took place in Constantinople with primarily Eastern bishops. And then there were 2 attempts at reunification where the Eastern delegation was present, the Second Council of Leon and the Council of Florence. So people who say that are just speaking from ignorance. Furthermore, we see calls in various councils for unity between the West and the East, and a call to help protect Constantinople from the invasion of the Turks. To me, this demonstrates that the Catholic Church is the one church that is trying to live up to Jesus' call for unity. Speaking of which, this brings me to a 5th revelation for me. Studying these councils changed my mind about the Crusades. I will admit I don't know much about the Crusades, but I've for a long time bought into the modernist Western view that the Crusades were a stain on Catholic history. In reading these council documents, you get the understanding of just how big a threat Islam was on Christendom, both in terms of spreading a false religion and the conquest of territories. The primary purpose of these Crusades was to protect the Holy Land from falling into the hands of the Muslims. I don't know how successful the Crusades were as a military campaign. I hope to do a series down the road where I can really dive into this further. But I imagine that if it weren't for the Crusades, most of the West back then, and even maybe the West now, would be Muslim. My 6th and final reflection of this, something I've been saying all along, is that the most challenging part of an ecumenical council is disseminating the council's decisions and implementing it faithfully across Christendom. We saw that from the very first council to the very last one. After Arianism was denounced, it didn't just go away. Many of the bishops who voted to condemn Arianism went back home and faced such resistance from the people that they just went back to their Arian teachings. And as we saw with the Second Vatican Council, opportunists didn't faithfully implement the council's decisions, but instead reinvented aspects of Catholic life, calling it the spirit of Vatican II. This resulted in an enormous setback in the theological, ecclesiastical, liturgical, and vocational life of the Church. In fact, I would argue that maybe it's just in the last 5 years or so that we're truly starting to see the authentic fruits of Vatican II in the life of the Church. If I could leave you with one thought, it's that as faithful Catholics, we owe it to God, to our church fathers, and ourselves to study these ecumenical councils. Mark Twain famously said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." And if nothing else, these ecumenical councils can teach us about where the church has been, the issues it has wrestled with, and so when it encounters similar issues in the future, we can say, you know what? We've already dealt with this. Let's glean from the wisdom of our church fathers. I want to close by saying thank you for joining me for this series. I had no idea that this series would be so insightful and so well received by listeners. Thank you for sharing the episodes and all of your positive feedback. I am truly humbled. I want to close out this series with one more episode, something fun. If I were Pope and I called a council, what would it entail? I hope you'll join me next time as we conclude this series on the 21 Ecumenical Councils. Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at Why Catholic Podcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.